Hi, everyone, and welcome to the joint Trainee Hub event hosted by the University of Toronto's Edwin S.H. Leong Centre for Healthy Children and the University of British Columbia's Edwin S.H. Leong Centre for Healthy Aging. My name is Priscilla Medeiros. I'm the Knowledge Mobilization and Community Engagement Specialist at the Leong Centre for Healthy Children. It is my absolute pleasure to open and co-moderate today's session with Kim Schmidt, who's the Research Director of the UBC Leong Center. So I'd like to acknowledge that we at the Edwin S.H. Leong Center for Healthy Children are located on the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and Mississaugas of the Credit. We recognize and honor the Indigenous peoples. We have cared for this land for thousands of years, and today, this land remains a vibrant meeting place for many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And from coast to coast, I acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. And today, we'll be discussing how to form advisory groups that meaningfully contribute to research. Topics will include timing, strategies for authentic engagement, as well as structuring collaborative committees. And our panelists will also be sharing examples from their own work, highlighting how they support and sustain partner involvement across that trajectory of the research process. So I am incredibly pleased to welcome our four panelists. First, we have Jill Zwicker, who's a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Pediatric Brain Development and Rehabilitation, Professor in Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy at UBC, and Investigator at BC's Children's Hospital Research Institute. Our second speaker will be Andi Camden, who's an epidemiologist and senior research associate at the Leong Centre for Healthy Children, as well as an ICES fellow. Her research focuses on leveraging administrative data to explore the impacts of opioids during pregnancy on maternal and child health across the life course. And our third grouping of speakers today includes Connor Kearns, who's an associate professor, registered psychologist, and director of Anxiety, Stress, and Autism program in the Department of Psychology at UBC. Her research focuses on anxiety and stress-related disorders in autistic youth and young adults, with the aim of developing and testing new assessment tools. And of course, Mackenzie Landerhole, who has been working with the UBC's Anxiety, Stress, and Autism Program Lab for 2 years, facilitating their community advisory board. She also works as an inclusion supervisor and a support worker for autistic adolescents and adults with intellectual disabilities. So a big welcome to our panelists for today's session. I'm going to hand things over to our first speaker, Jill, who will be presenting on her work.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for including me today. And I am first like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from the traditional ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, which is colonially known as Vancouver. And I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, work, and play on these lands as an uninvited guest. So I'm going to share with you today some of my experience with family engagement and research, but I have a few waivers, I guess, to share. First of all, just to give you the context of where I'm coming from, I'm a pediatric occupational therapist, and because of that, I've had a lot of clinical experience in involving families in rehabilitation. So involving families has always been part of my work. But a relatively new venture of including families in research, not as participants, but as partners. So I am not an expert, but I do value the involvement of families and would like to share some information from you of what I've learned over the last several years. Because this is something relatively new and wasn't part of my PhD training or postdoc, I've pursued professional development opportunities that I'll share with you that might also be helpful for your professional development. And finally, I'll just touch on some practical experience with family engagement and research. What I should say is the term, you may hear patient engagement, family engagement, people with lived or living experience. So I've used those terms interchangeably, but just to clarify that family refers to both the individual and the significant others in their lives. And same with patient engagement. That includes families as well. So some of the work that I've done, these courses are still available now. There's a family engagement research course that's offered through Kids Brain Health Network and McMaster University. It's 10 weeks long for about 30 hours of time. And I actually took this course with a parent partner that I invited to join. So we took it at the same time together, which was really meaningful. I was then offered to pursue the Family Engagement and Research Leadership Academy, which was also through Kids Brain Health and McMaster for about 20 hours of training. And then I'm a member of the Child Bright Network, and Child Bright offers many resources, and some of which I'll share with you today about engaging with patients and families. So I'll start off by talking about why is partnership with people with lived experience important. Obviously, the involvement of patients and families ensures that the research is highly relevant to the people, and you can say nothing without us. Nothing about us without us is kind of the saying here, that if we're trying to conduct research that has an impact on families, then we need to include them in all stages of the research process. And people with lived experience come with their own expertise and have important contributions that can impact not only what research questions are important to answer, but how to go about the research and then how best to share and disseminate that information. It's also become an important strategic initiative of funding agencies such as the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And essentially, grants are expected to have patient-oriented research. And so they say patients must be involved as much and as meaningfully as possible in order for health research to be more responsive to the needs of Canadians. However, when it becomes something mandated like this, then there's a risk for tokenistic involvement, for people to do a checkbox to say, yes, I've consulted with patients. And so what's really important is that patient engagement must be authentic. And this includes both meaningful and active collaboration in all aspects, including governance, priority setting, conducting research, and in knowledge translation. And to be authentic, you also need to be willing to listen to patient stories and also be very aware of the power dynamic. So even though we are trying to be collaborators with patients, there is an inherent power differential, and we want to incorporate strategies to mitigate that power. And also to recognize that it takes time to build trust and mutual respect. So it's not something that happens quickly, and often, not in time for grant deadlines. So we need to plan this well in advance. And the other important comment I'll share is that patient partners deserve compensation. So we bring our expertise about the research process and perhaps content expertise, but they bring the expertise of lived experience and should be compensated for their work. There are guidelines. This is taken from Child Bright, that as a member of the research team, for approximately 20 hours of work, $600 per year is recommended, which translates into a minimum hourly wage of about $30 per hour. I actually try to pay more than this if possible, and also to ask families how they wish to be paid, whether that payment is in cash or perhaps gift cards. Because for some families, if they're on a disability pension, for instance, don't want to accept cash payment that would take their income over their pension limit, for instance. And so offering choice in how to be paid. And some families may also decline to be paid, and that's fine too, but we should at least have the offer. And then in addition to that, to consider compensation for childcare if necessary and/or travel if that's part of the requirement. And of course, compensation if they happen to co-present with you or and things like that. So making patient partners paid. But I also have to say that through this process, that patients and families also need to have some training about the research process. And we as investigators and trainees also need training in family engagement. So it's a two-way street here. Because I was witness to, my first conference where people with lived experience were invited to participate in the conference. Didn't work out very well because there was no education or context given to families, and families came with, I guess, the need to tell their story, but also some anger and some other, if they felt that they, had a voice that they wanted to be heard. But the truth is, the audience that was there were all committed and wanting to be, involved and provide support and find avenues for their voice. And so the communication was mismatched for the content or the context of the conference. And so while there's a time and a place for that kind of communication, they also need to have some training and some expertise about what's involved in research. So there's a few options that I've just put here that I'm aware of. There's a patient engagement and research through the Arthritis Society that's for both researchers and families. The family engagement and research course that I've talked about already. And then there's also important, it's a patient-oriented research training for people with neuromuscular disorders. And I'm sure there's many others available. So if you Google search, I'm sure you'll find something that's relevant for the people with whom you're working. But bottom line is some training is important for both parties. And there are several tips and tricks for researchers, and I've put a link here to some other resources on the CanChild website, but just some that I think are pivotal is to engage people with lived experience as early as possible in the research process. You actually want them to help conceive ideas. And so you don't come up with your research plan and then say, hey, let's consult with families and see if they agree. You really want that co-development from the beginning. You also want some clarity around motives and expectations. So motives not only for the families, what is their motivation for wanting to be involved in research, but also what is your motive for having families engaged in your research? And some clarity around their roles, the time commitment, and the timelines that are required. And as I said, from all stages of the research process. And if for some reason the feedback that you get from families cannot be adopted, then be honest and tell them why it's not possible, and they may be able to co-develop another plan or another option. But engagement in research doesn't have to be, a full-on commitment for the duration of the study. There's different levels of engagement that families can choose, from one level of just informing and consulting to being a full-on partner collaborating with the researcher, or ultimately to eventually leading the work. So there is this range of involvement. And depending on the family's capacity and desire to be involved, keep this in mind with what you're asking of families. And I'm just going to take you to a website for a moment just to show how I operationalize this in my lab. Um, so this is a section of my website about family engagement, and I've provided 4 levels of engagement with a time estimate so that families can determine what capacity they have to contribute. So level 1 is informing, which is perhaps one meeting of 1 to 2 hours. Level 2 might be consulting, 2 or 3 meetings of 1 to 2 hours. Level 3 would be getting more involved and with a bigger time commitment of up to 6 meetings a year, so bi-monthly. And then level 4, collaborating. So basically being a co-investigator on a grant from 1 to 3 years with monthly or bi-monthly meetings. So this just gives families the opportunity to see where they might want to contribute. And I think that the time commitment is useful to lay out from the beginning. And then I just wanted to provide some examples of patient engagement that I've been engaged with. First was inviting people with lived experience to be on panels and speakers at an international conference that I organized. And with that, we also established a nonprofit society. It used to be just for researchers, but we changed the name to Research and Advocacy for Developmental Coordination Disorder, and opened this up to families and organizations with an interest in DCD. And we even have a director position on the board that is a person with lived experience, and she is coordinating with other families and people with lived experience. So they're part and parcel of this organization, not an add-on. So they're embedded within it. We also have included people with lived experience in the revision process of international clinical practice guidelines, focusing on outcomes that are important to children and families. And I routinely now have a family advisory board on each research grant or project that I run. And I know others will talk about that process in their work. Oh. And including people with lived experience as authors is also important, but I have to say the field is not quite ready for this. And so this is just an example of a letter to an editor. As part of this conference that we organized, the families had some very powerful stories to tell, and I wanted to share those more broadly with their consent so that others could learn from their stories. And so I submitted their stories as a special part of the special issue from the conference. And the editors said, oh, well, we can't accept that. It's not research. And so I kind of wrote back and talked about the importance of engaging with families and whatnot. And they ultimately said, well, you could submit it as a letter to the editor. So we did that, and just to start to hopefully change the narrative and incorporate patients as authors. The other interesting thing in this process is when you go to submit an article, you have to put your organizational affiliation, and that can't be left blank. And so that's another spot that needs to be changed to incorporate families as well. But there are still some other lessons to be learned here. So what I find is the people who have been volunteering or wanting to engage or get more involved tend to be women, usually of higher education and higher socioeconomic status. I do have one father, but the diversity of representation is something that I'm trying to work on, and this is a challenge with family engagement. Is if we're just relying on volunteers, we're going to have a bias sample. So that's something to just keep in mind, and it's definitely a work in progress. The other challenge is to do family engagement right, you want to engage them from the very beginning, from the conception of the project. But at that time, you may not have funding to pay them. And so this is a little tricky balance that, and there's no guarantee that you're going to be funded. But just to be upfront with the people with whom you're working that this is a possibility, or maybe you can borrow some funds from a different grant, or apply for planning grants to bring people together. So there's starting to be other opportunities for this, but still a challenge. And then the final piece of the work in progress is allowing ample time for people to review materials, which means you have to be much more in advance of grant deadlines than perhaps you're used to. And this is a constant challenge with the balance of time and workload. So, but to be respectful of their time, to give them enough time to contribute. I'll leave it there and let my colleagues carry on with the conversation, but hopefully that gives you some information to start. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Next is Andi.
Oh no, hang on. See. Okay. Can you, Priscilla, is everything okay?
It's perfect.
Yeah, okay, great. I'm just gonna move this. Okay, so I'll be talking about establishing meaningful advisory committees from the context of my research that's focused on maternal and child health. So throughout this presentation, I'll be referring to advisory groups that are established in two of my projects. The first project is from my postdoctoral research at U of T with Dr. Hilary Brown, whose research program uses community-oriented methods. And the main training goal of my postdoc was to use inclusive research methods. So I conducted a series of studies that used admin data held at ICES to describe patterns of medication use, including opioids and pregnancy among people with disabilities in Ontario. And we started small, which I think is okay, and what I hope to show you today. So we started small, and we had an advisory group with 3 members who had lived experience of medication use, disability, and pregnancy. And then I'll also share some examples from the work that I'm currently leading. So I'm leading a project called the Canadian Perinatal Opioid Project. It's funded by PHAC, and we are currently developing the first pan-Canadian online surveillance system to measure opioid use in pregnancy and subsequent impacts on maternal and child health. And you can see from my map here that it's really a collaborative project. We have multiple provinces involved. We have very strong community engagement. So we have 3 advisory groups. One is with knowledge users. That group currently has around 19 people. And then we have 2 other advisory groups for people with lived experience. So one is specific to people who identify as Indigenous, and then the other is non-Indigenous. And most recently, we also hired a peer researcher, which has been a really amazing process, I have to say. And we additionally too have, so we have the advisory group, and then we have other opportunities for engagement. So we have a couple different opportunities to do individual interviews. So I thought I would frame my talk around some common questions that maybe seem a little simple, but these are the things as I was going through with my postdoc work, and then most recently that I've been thinking through. So why do I want to include advisory groups in my research project? Where do I start? Where do I find advisory group members? How much do I pay advisory group members? What can I ask? And how can I support advisory group members are the questions we'll go through. So to start, why do I want to include advisory groups in my research? I really, like Jill said, I respect the philosophy of nothing about us without us. And my goal is to lead an inclusive research program. I primarily work with administrative data. And while there's several strengths to admin data, we often can't address the whys. So I find that having an advisory group to discuss research findings with has really improved the impact of my work. And it also makes it more relevant and applicable. I also find that engagement is really helpful for researchers who aren't clinician scientists, like myself. So it's really nice to be able to have a connection to the population that our work impacts. And I feel like overall it provides a deeper understanding of the topic area. Further, for populations who are particularly stigmatized, such as people who use drugs, I feel like engagement really brings that needed human element to our research, and it's really useful to start breaking stigma through storytelling. And on a personal note, I find working with people with lived experience to be incredibly inspiring, and it's a great reminder of why we do the work we do. So one tip I've learned from Priscilla is to be crystal clear on what your ask is and the type of engagement you're looking for. So I usually use this diagram of the research cycle to explain where we are interested in having input. So in both of my projects, we've had our advisory group members involved in all stages of the research process. And then we translate that into a role. So this would be in terms of reference or something where you can then see that we're looking for advisory group members to guide our research, to make sure we're asking the right questions, to develop recommendations. Oh, sorry, to review high-level findings and provide input on interpretation, to develop recommendations with the research team, and also to assist the research team to develop useful tools that can be shared back with community members. And then in terms of where do I start? For me, because I was staff at Sick Kids, I started with the resources that were available from my team at the Leong Center. And I'm also fortunate to be on the same team as Priscilla. So initially I signed up for the community engagement series, and I felt like these were really useful seminars to be able to learn about applied examples. And then in 2023, I signed up for the Trainee Hub. For me, it was a really safe space to ask questions. I was designing my postdoc work in parallel. So it was a really useful opportunity where I could start digging into some of the more detailed questions. And then lastly, I had a community engagement consulting service with Priscilla, where we really went over my whole research engagement plans, and we discussed my terms of reference, the flyer. We kind of went over everything, and I found it was really helpful to have a second set of eyes and expertise. One thing we talked about, which relates to some comments that Jill was talking about with representativity, is just to make sure that you'll have your external eligibility. So for example, we're looking for advisory group members who have experience with opioids in pregnancy or 18 years old who live in specific provinces. But you'll also have your internal criteria as well. So while this is, describes the people we're looking for, we also want to make sure that we have some variability in terms of the type of opioids that people use. So perhaps we would like people who are in treatment for opioid use disorder, people who use opioids for pain, and then also thinking about geographic representation as well. So just something to think about there. And then these are just two examples of a flyer for advisory groups, and then one of our flyers that we've used for individual interviews. So just trying to be super clear about what the role is, what the time commitment looks like. Okay, so number 3 is where do I find advisory group members? So I have taken a layered approach with both of my projects. I initially start with my network, and then I've tried to identify people in my network who may have an existing advisory group that includes people who meet my eligibility criteria. And then, excuse me, for my disability research, we really were thinking more broadly about people who had disabilities that necessitated medication. So conditions like MS or spinal cord injury, epilepsy. So we reached out to a number of organizations that support people with these disabilities, like MS Canada, and we reached out, we shared the flyer, and we asked if they would be willing to share our flyer for us, included in newsletters or in outreach. And generally, people were really helpful. We found that a few organizations actually have like a research portal that's dedicated to this very thing. So I think it is certainly worth reaching out. And then from there, I think a snowball approach is really useful. So you can contact people who have already said that they're interested and see if they have peers or know other people who may be interested. For my opioid research, again, we started with our network. We had two co-investigators who had similar advisory groups, so they shared our flyers. And then we also have one of our co-PIs and a couple colleagues who've done qualitative work in this area. So because we knew that they had done qualitative research, they had a connection to our target population, so they were able to share the flyers. We also contacted relevant organizations, and because this was a larger grant where we had project partners like national and provincial organizations, we were also able to reach out to people who said they supported our project to then say, would you like to sit on an advisory as a knowledge user? So that was another way we were able to find people. And wherever possible, we always made sure that the person who had the strongest connection was the one who was reaching out and sharing our recruitment materials. And then, as I mentioned, we have a peer researcher on our team, and they have contacts across Canada. So again, it's just another approach that's been really helpful. And then we have used snowballing as well. How much do I pay advisory group members? So, similar to what Jill said, there are several guidelines out there. I find that they vary quite a bit. So, I've seen on the lower end to be around $25 an hour or what a research assistant would make, all the way up to higher amounts. So, I like to think of honoraria in terms of compensating people, not just for their time, but for their knowledge and the skills and the experience that they've acquired over the years. So I try and pay what my budget allows. In my postdoc, I had a CIHR research allowance, so I used that, and we paid people $150 for a 90-minute meeting. In my opioid research now, we are providing people with $100 per meeting. And in addition, I think it's really important to think about allocating budget to remove equity barriers. So being able to provide a budget for supports like childcare costs so people can attend your meeting, or any accommodations that are needed. Having flexible timing so you're not just holding meetings during business hours, but at different times, I think is really important. And something I realized recently is not everyone has licenses for Microsoft. So sometimes I think it's useful that you're using Google Docs or something that's free and everyone can access. So thinking about those types of considerations. I just realized I skipped events. So these are the dollar amounts that I've seen for events, so half and full day. And then for co-presenting, I've seen it around $250. And then where possible, I think cash over gift cards or allowing choice. I think with only providing gift cards is a bit patronizing because researchers are providing these gift cards and kind of saying where money can be spent, and it gives the impression that we don't trust people with money. So I think where possible, being able to have a choice. And I know ethics boards sometimes dictate what you can do, but we have had success pushing back a little bit on this lately. What can I ask advisory group members? So one of the things I've learned from my trainee hub meetings is that it is so important to take the time to get to know one another and to start to build trust. So the entire first meeting that I have with advisory group members is just about getting to know each other. There's no work objective. And twice now I've used these prompts on the screen. So asking people about their name and pronouns, asking about them, including any triggers, which is a more recent one that we've added, a fun or boring fact, their connection to this topic, and what they're hoping to get out of participating. And I find that these questions, they really elicit a lot. I always say, share what you're comfortable with. There's no pressure. And I always go first. So I answer any question I ask of people, I answer first just to try to achieve some balance. And I also show pictures just to be a little bit more personal. Um, and and then I also find it's really helpful in the first meeting too to start talking about some priorities, what people are most interested in. And I find it's useful for several reasons. So one, it's really interesting to see what the community thinks and what their ideas are. It helps you assess the alignment between the research team and your advisory group. And I think it also shows you any areas where you might need to pivot. So if there's a lot of interest in, say, breastfeeding, and that's not something you had really thought of, then it kind of first up, it gives you an idea of like, maybe we need to expand our team. Maybe that's out of scope and we explain it, but at least you can address it early on. I also like to have conversations about language. I find it's always changing, and it's sometimes hard to know which terms people are most comfortable with. So, for example, in some of my disability work, do people prefer person first language or identity first language? And we recently had a conversation about opioid use because some people don't like the term use. So I find it's really helpful up front to talk about these terms, and then we can be more sensitive in our discussions. And then, um, and then having a peer researcher, I find is really helpful when you're unsure. So I'm not an expert in this area. I'm learning as I go. And I find that having a peer researcher with a trusting relationship is great because I can go to her and say, like, this is something we really want to ask. Do you think it would be triggering? Could we ask it in a better way? And she's the first set of eyes on that topic. So she can be like, she can change the question, nuance it a little bit. And it's really helpful, I think, before you get to the advisory group to be able to have those conversations. And how can I support advisory group members? So one thing I think is useful is having very clear terms of reference that outline what it looks like to work together. So I usually have a bit of a background, details about the role, eligibility criteria, terms of engagement. So, things like creating a respectful environment, respecting differences. Compensation is always in there. Any additional supports that we have available. I include the frequency of meetings, stuff about intellectual property and co-authorship is in there. I think check-ins are also a nice way to support advisory group members. So if there's a meeting that's particularly, heavy with academics, was that meeting okay? I know with our peer researcher, when she first met the team, I checked in with her afterwards to see how it went. And I think also check-ins in between meetings is important because we've had people come back and be like, are you still doing this work? And it has only been a month, but I think people like to be engaged and know what's happening and know when the next meeting is. In terms of flexibility, I think it's important to recognize that people are often multitasking. Like in my work, especially, there's a lot of parents who have children who have jobs who are, trying their best to make the advisory group meeting work. So I think being flexible for lateness or people who can't make it. And then respecting when people just need to tune out because it's too much and maybe their cameras are off or they drop off early because it's a sensitive subject. And then most importantly, a safety plan. So this is something we've been working on lately, is just having a plan and kind of a decision tree. So if someone was to experience distress, when would we call 911? Or do we have somebody on call or someone within 24 hours that could connect with them to provide support? So I hope those tips are useful. I just wanted to thank my advisory group members and Priscilla and Hillary, who have been fantastic mentors in this area. Just stop sharing.
Great presentation, Andi. I'm going to hand it over to our last group of speakers, Connor and Mac.
All right, you can see our screen?
Yes.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Okay, perfect.
So I'm Connor Kearns. I'm a clinical psychologist and the professor of psychology at UBC, Department of Psychology at UBC, and the PI of the Anxiety, Stress, and Autism Lab. And Mac, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, I'm Mac. I'm a founding member of the Planning Committee for the Community Advisory Board, and I'm one of their facilitators. And I'm an autistic and ADHD member of the lab.
Can you do the next slide, Mac?
Yeah.
And the next one. So I want to tell you just a little bit about the research that we do, and I do want to acknowledge that we are situated on the unceded territory of the Musqueam at the University of British Columbia, and very lucky to be working there, and appreciative. Um, the focus of our research is really examining the overlap and assessment and treatment of anxiety and stress-related conditions in children and young adults on the spectrum. And I really related to a lot of what Dr. Zwicker said, which is I want to acknowledge that I'm not an expert in community engagement, but I am coming from a place that one of the reasons I got interested in clinical psychology is because I think the discipline really embraces integration of clinical practice and research. So it's always been a central value of mine that the research that I do is informed by the work that I do with clients, with children and their families, and vice versa. I want the research to directly inform the what we give back to those families, so to feed into practice. The particular questions that we explore in our research also are really looking at kind of the distinct ways that individuals on the spectrum may experience stressors and express anxiety and traumatic stress. So, for that reason, being able to talk with community members, not only as participants, but also engaging in them in the research to inform what our measures look like, to really from the get-go think about what the treatments might look like, how they're going to be well received and delivered, has seemed critical from the beginning. So while I'm not an expert in community engagement, it is quite, it's a value that I think I've held for a long time. And I am now going to share with you our process for trying to do this work, which has not been perfect, but we are trying to take those steps forward. Next slide, please. So one thing that we've been trying to do at the lab is actually to build a standing community advisory board within the lab. And what I mean by that is it's a community advisory board that will exist in kind of long term as a feature of the lab, as opposed to us just engaging community members around a specific project. And the reason we really wanted to take on an initiative like this is that we thought it would be important to have a standing board for a variety of research projects that we take on, which might be things that I'm leading as a PI, but also as a professor at UBC, it might be the honors and directed studies projects that students put forward. It might be the projects of my graduate students and postdocs. We really wanted there to be something in place for every trainee in the lab, as well as myself, to be regularly kind of running these projects through the eyes of community members to make sure that our research priorities are truly aligned with the community, and also really critically to enhance our methods and our mission. So part of the reason the Community Advisory Board is so important in my mind is that we really need that community input to make sure that we are recruiting effectively for these research studies, to make sure that we're asking the right questions, to check out our measures and things about them that we may have blind spots about, think about how to improve them, and then also, of course, to think about how to interpret our findings and disseminate them to the community. And I think that's another one of the key aims of this community advisory board is to have a group kind of standing in place to think about helping us bridge the research and bringing it out into the community. What are the best ways to do that? How do we reach community members? How do we translate our findings so they can be accessible and usable by the community? And finally, as I alluded to, because we're in a psychology department, a lot of what I do is mentorship and trainees. I also think that having the community advisory board is really essential to create training opportunities for undergraduates all the way through early career faculty members who I work with to, as part of their training, be working with community members, and to have this forum where they have the opportunity to pilot their research ideas to the community members and get feedback about it, work directly with people from the community, and also get feedback on, what their take-home messages are, how they're interpreting their results. Okay, next slide, Mac. Some key considerations that have come up just thinking about, this from the kind of the initial questions when you're thinking about creating a community advisory board in your lab. Some of the top ones for us, the things I think are important to think about initially, have been really like thinking about the goals of the lab and the organization, and as was mentioned by Dr. Zwicker, the way that you're going to be interacting with your community advisory board, really having a good sense of that ahead of time before approaching community members so you can have a transparent conversation with them of what you're looking for and really direct their efforts. It's also, and I think I'm going to be reiterating many themes that you may have heard already. It's important to think about your resources, your funding, the personnel available you have to do this work, because it is quite an undertaking to do it in, I think, a meaningful way. And part of that as well, the resource of time and how much time you need to kind of, as we've heard, plan these efforts, think about the way the board will interact with your lab with specific research projects, get materials to people ahead of time, including grants, right, as opposed to doing those grants in the last minute, and also including manuscripts, which sometimes have tight turnarounds as well. All right, next slide. And you've seen this slide, this image, this figure before. I also think it's quite an important one. It really describes these different ways that we can engage with the community in our research, all the way from the most basic level, which is just informing the community about what we're doing, or really doing one-off consultation with community members, to more regularly involving them in your research, which is where we've decided our community advisory board sits. So we have this community advisory board because we want to more regularly engage and get feedback on everything that we're doing from community members. And we also want to be held accountable to answering how we've integrated their feedback, which is a bit different than saying we're going to do everything that you asked us to do. We are more sitting in a spot of we will tell you why we did or did not decide to implement, or how we decided to implement what you've told us. We think by having this standing community advisory board, though, that we're also kind of creating the environment, or I'm hoping sowing the seeds to enable more collaborative and empowering work in the future. So, for example, the training goals that I mentioned that are part of our CAB, I think are creating the pathways to engage autistic students, to be trained in research, in psychology, to learn how to develop research ideas, and then to move forward to actually be leaders of investigations in the future. And for us to align our ideas as well in terms of what I, as a PI, can effectively supervise. Because that is another pragmatic constraint. And I think it's another reason why it's important to be clear with community members about what you're offering, is that there are so many important things to be researched, and we can't do it all, and we have to focus our research programs. So talking about alignment in that way as well. Okay, next slide.
All right, let's talk about the timing that it takes to establish advisory committees. All right, and we decided to form a board, and when we did that, the first action was literature review and recruiting research assistants to form the planning committee. This started in June of 2023. This is how I and another autistic RA were brought into the lab. Since then, we brought on 2 more RAs to form a 7-person team. And that team worked to create the community advisory board, which was quite an iterative process. As the planning committee, we designed ideas for what the board would look like and created materials based on literature reviews and discussions. When we perfected our drafts, we proposed them to the steering committee, which was a group that we created in December of 2023. And they were a small board consisting of a parent, a developmental pediatrician, an autistic adult, and a member of an autism organization. And they gave us feedback based on their lived experiences and expertise, and provided a much needed outside perspective on all of our ideas and documents. Then the planning committee would take their edits and apply them, and then show them back to the steering committee in their next meeting. So we wanted to make sure that we were accurately applying their edits. And then we sort of did that circular process through 3 meetings. And then we moved on and started to get ready for our CAB. That developmental foundation of materials took about a year. This was heavily influenced by starting from nothing, the length of the recruitment process, and scheduling conflicts with the steering committee. We are also actively researching the community advisory board, which has made it a more difficult and timelier process. But we were doing this so the process and the materials can be shared with other labs and organizations so they have an easier process starting their board. So ideally, it won't take a year for other groups to get started. Um, Alrighty. For recruitment, we created flyers and posted them around campus for the community advisory board, and we posted them virtually. We reached out to people who had already expressed interest in joining the lab and contacted them. And then we also contacted our existing partners. 3 of the 4 members of our steering committee are serving on our community advisory board. And then we created a survey for applicants to fill out. And then from that, those applicants, we selected a group of people to interview based on the diversity of perspective we were looking for. We were looking for autistic adults, ideally early diagnosed, as the 3 autistic planning committee members were all late diagnosed and all of us are females. And as Jill mentioned, women are more likely to volunteer, so we were looking for men, funnily enough, because autism is a very male-dominated field. We were looking for clinicians, and we were looking for parents of autistic people, and we wanted to include as many people perspectives as possible. So we focused on rural communities, people with indigeneity, immigrant experience, and experience with autistic people with high support needs, and those who are non-speaking who may not be able to be members of the board, but we wanted to make sure that we had perspectives from people who live with them, love them, work with them, to make sure that their perspectives are included. Yeah, and then we did virtual interviews to decide who we wanted to involve, and we selected based on breadth of experience. And in those meetings, we had 1 to 2 research assistants and the lab director. We thought it was really important to have Connor in those meetings to show how important it is. We wanted to make sure people knew that we weren't looking for tokenistic inclusion, that the person who's running this whole lab actually cared about it, and also to humanize her because there's a lot of power dynamics that you have to deal with. So having Connor there would hopefully make it feel more communicative in future community advisory board meetings. This is the membership that we have. As you can see, there's a lot of overlap. A lot of people are also sit in multiple connections to the community, which is wonderful. We get more perspectives that way. And then this here is our steering committee. And we just want to reiterate our thanks for them. Jack, Angie, Tandy, and Brock for their invaluable input. And this is from our 3rd and final meeting with them. All the work that we put into this, all of the 2 years now that we've been working on it, has all been worthwhile. So yeah, no, it's a long process for us, but it's really, really worth it. And hopefully it'll be easier for other groups based off of the work that we've done.
Okay, great. And now I do want to talk a little bit about what some of that planning, what it helped us put in place in terms of our ideas and our ways of communicating with the board once it was finally launched. There's all the planning you do, and then there's the testing of it. And we're in the testing phase right now. So I do really want to present these as things we've thought a lot about, and we're in the phase of kind of experimenting with, but we don't have the data yet about like if this actually transformed and made it more collaborative or not. But we can show you our intention and our thought behind it. Can you do the next slide, Mac? So one of the big things, one of my favorite things that came out of all this work has actually been this value statement. And this was something that came out of our advisory committee, but which we also then presented and discussed with all of our CAB members ahead of their entry into the CAB and our first meeting. We felt it was really important to develop a value statement because we were very interested in bringing in people with diverse experiences and thus perspectives. We thought that's really essential for getting good input on autism research. However, it also raises the opportunity of conflict and disagreement and potentially distress. And I was quite trepidatious about wanting to make sure that if we ask people to do this work with us, we have been thoughtful about how to make it a safe environment and protect all involved and to try and make these conversations productive. So a lot of time was spent thinking about what are our values to orient people to the board and kind of what they were getting into and to guide our work. The first one we decided upon was accessibility, which is, making it clear that on our community advisory board in our lab, we are committed to creating a space where needs are understood and where supports are provided to the extent that they can be. It's also a value of this board that we're looking for diversity. Oh, can you go back, Meg?
Sorry.
And that may not always be the case depending on the research project that you have, right? There might be some research questions where you actually want more people with very similar experiences or coming from a particular perspective. But because this is a standing board that we wanted to advise on a variety of research projects and also just the way that we reach out to the autistic community, we wanted a diversity of backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives. We also wanted to make sure that everybody could identify a common purpose. And that's something we think about in every meeting, which is kind of understanding from the get-go and trying to find common ground as a collective about, even though we have different perspectives, we might even use different words to talk about autism, very common issue that comes up. Why are we all here? Is there a joint investment in improving the lives of people on the spectrum? Everybody's passionate about this work. Everybody sees research as a vehicle for making positive change, even if it's not always done well, right? We also wanted to really lean into this idea of discourse, which is that having diverse perspectives on the lab, on the community advisory board, which should allow us to have different opinions and lived experiences and have those things exist in one space. So one really critical thing that we actually had to talk through is that we are not actually seeking consensus from our community advisory board. We just want to actually learn from the different experiences that are there and not force everybody to agree. And I think that's actually quite important to articulate from the get-go. We also wanted to think about how to make a safe space. So to really say from the beginning, we expect people to feel that they can be heard and respected, but also let people know from the get-go, you're free to be wrong. And let's think about being willing to change our stances. What is the point of this discourse if we're not trying to actually evolve in our understanding of one another and enhance the research? We also wanted to say from the get-go that we are interested in science-driven kind of dialogue, work, that there is a value to science, that the scientific method in particular is something that we think is important and helps us not get to truth, like that's a one definable thing, but better estimations, better understanding, and that there is some shared value around the scientific process, even if not all science is done in the right way or the best way. And finally, really this value of transparency and accountability. So being accountable to our board, even if we're not going to implement every suggestion given, letting them know how we made our decision and what we've decided to do with the feedback given. Can you do the next slide, Mac? Sorry. We may have a freezing situation.
There we go.
Yes, we also did develop engagement guidelines that were shared with the board ahead of time to have a plan in place, as mentioned by Andi, for if serious distress comes up, if harmful behavior happens, if there are harmful words, language, or even aggression that would come out in the meeting, trying to think through these things ahead of time. So we had a plan in place for how we would handle distress. We did try to define kind of the most extreme examples of what harmful conflict would be, what would be kind of unacceptable behavior, ways to interact with other people on the board, and what steps would be taken if that happened. We set defined paths and identified specific people that if distress or harmful conflict comes up in the meetings, that they can take those paths to debrief and get support and for us to make a plan. So you're not just in this meeting starting to feel overwhelmed and then just needing to check out and feeling like you don't know who to talk to or how to talk to or how to bring up your concerns. And importantly, we thought about both having, ways within the Zoom meetings that we're running, but also asynchronous ways to communicate. So to get in touch with us before or after meetings to really express concerns. We also thought about who are going to be the facilitators of these meetings and the support people. The facilitators are actually two members of the lab who are students, but also community members to lead the discussions. It's not me leading the discussion. And I think that's really important because there is a power dynamic between particularly the PI and the community, particularly when the PI is presenting their kind of research idea. So we wanted our facilitators to be not the lab director. We also wanted to identify somebody who's actually one of the community members of the board for our meeting facilitators to be able to debrief with if something came up in the meeting, or even to just get feedback about how did that meeting go. And for me, again, this was something that was really important to work through because as a clinical psychologist, I actually do feel like the tendency to maybe go into a clinical supervision mode and want to provide that support. But I have a dual role in this circumstance, which could be potentially problematic. So I wanted to make sure there were some other people identified for our facilitators to connect with and talk to about some of these issues. Okay. We also did have explicit kind of conversations about confidentiality. Originally, we put forward an idea, which is that everything you say in this meeting is going to be confidential and we're not going to share it outside of that. But actually, through the discussion of our first board meeting, we've adjusted this and modified it because board members actually felt like, well, there could be some usefulness in me identifying myself as part of this board and actually using my connections to translate some of what we talk about here to the community and vice versa. So we've actually approached a strategy now of asking people, conducting a survey about what level of confidentiality they want, like how much they want shared about themselves or what they might say in meetings outside of that context. So that's actually evolved. Okay.
All right, let's talk about fostering authentic engagement. We wanted members of the CAB to feel comfortable to and capable of sharing their feedback. We asked them to fill out a survey of access needs before and communication styles to help this. So when they were invited to join our community advisory board, they were sent this survey and we collected a lot of information about them and how they wanted to communicate, sensory needs, communication, scheduling, planning, like getting reminders 2 days before that the meeting's happening, things like that. We also provide our documents that we will be reviewing in the meetings a week prior so they have time to review them and share the questions. And we also share the questions that we're going to ask so they have context while they're reading for what they're going to be asked about, what we're going to be talking about in our meetings. And then we also had them provide feedback on the engagement guidelines that they would follow. So we had some set guidelines that were like, we're not accepting any bigotry or anything that's explicitly intended this way. But then we also had some that were modifiable. We wanted to make sure that they were involved in meetings and they had a say in the way that the board that they were a member of was going to function. In meetings, during meetings, we ask members to keep their cameras on. Obviously, we invite them to turn their cameras off if they need to turn it off for a moment, if they're overwhelmed or anything. But we ask for them to keep their cameras on because sometimes we want to make sure that people are engaged. And we invite all members to respond to each question. So we have decided that we're going to be doing a round robin in our following meeting because we want to make sure that people feel like they're invited to provide feedback and also make sure that we are getting feedback from people. They are told which order, we're going to tell them which order that they're going in, just so they feel prepared and they know when they're going to be speaking, and then we'll go through it that way. We haven't yet done that in our second meeting because we haven't had our second meeting yet, but that's our idea moving forward. The facilitators we model engagement. We respond to each other, and we do little like, oh, that's a great idea. I agree with that. Little things like that, that establish the environment as friendly and conversational. Um, Often in Zoom, which is where we conduct our meetings, people feel afraid to jump in even more than they do in normal conversation when you're face to face. So we want to make sure that people sort of feel comfortable being like, oh yeah, just like little things like that. And then following our meetings, we make edits based on the community advisory board's feedback and share it with them, just like we did with the steering committee. And we do this to keep us accountable to the CAB and ensure that our edits are satisfactory. Um, then we also do check-in surveys after each meeting. We did this with the steering committee and we're doing this with the community advisory board. We check in, see what went right, what went wrong, if they have any feedback, if they have any follow-up, if they have any additional feedback that just came to them afterwards or something that they didn't feel comfortable sharing in that meeting. So we want to make sure that people have as many opportunities to engage as possible. So yeah, that's what we're doing. And these are our key takeaways.
Yeah. So just some like kind of lessons learned so far. Developing the cab can be a lengthy process, but it's already been a rewarding one. And has transformed the way our website looks, the way that we bring trainees into the lab, onboard people into our lab processes, and creating all these different opportunities for really neurodiverse trainees at UBC. The process is iterative. It should be iterative. It needs to be iterative. We are learning as we go, and I think that's part of the process. And uh, having diverse cabs, I think it should be a goal. It's really a critical way to make our research more relevant and more grounded in reality. But we need to think about like how to bring those different perspectives together in a safe, collaborative, and productive way, and to think about how to allow them to authentically engage when they may not agree with each other, right? And where there may be points of conflict. And that can be between advisory board members or between the community and the PI in some circumstances, right? So I think it's really important to kind of go in with some awareness about that and expectation that may occur and how do we want to handle that and how do we have respectful, engaged, productive conversation. Co-developing these engagement guidelines has been, I think, an effective, really useful way that we've approached how to do that. And I think one of the biggest lessons for me thus far, I really appreciate Dr. Zwicker's slide on the training that maybe community members should go through in order to engage with research, but also that researchers need to go through in order to communicate effectively with community members. I honestly am still in this learning process because let me tell you, it's a really tough transition to go from spending 3 weeks writing a grant. And then you're like, oh, I really want to run this by my community advisory board. And then trying to download what's been basically all of this information that I've been inhabiting that is on so many different levels and like throw it at people and ask them to give you feedback, right? Like that doesn't actually work very well. And I think what we've learned is trying to think really effectively about what are the most critical questions to ask, and focusing those questions, and thinking about how to deliver the information to a broader audience. And that actually takes some work. I think that's the work of the community advisory board in helping to train me as a scientist and also my trainees. So again, it's been such a worthwhile, incredible effort. I've already seen the benefits, and I'm so excited about the research that we're doing on this topic and how it's enhancing what we're doing. Okay. Yes, our website and our newsletter, and thanks for listening.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So the presenters, those were fantastic presentations and lots of very helpful information. We're going to open it up to questions now. So if you have a question, you can either raise your virtual hand and then I can call on you and you can unmute yourself to ask the question, or if you prefer, you can type it into the chat and I can read it out. So feel free now to let us know if you have a question. And then maybe as we just, I had one actually, so that I'll ask as we wait for other people to ask. It was actually for for Jill. I was curious, you mentioned that you have a family advisory board for every project or grant as opposed to a standing one, it sounded like. And I was just wondering if you could tell us why you chose to do that and if there's been any particular strengths or challenges to that approach.
I think because I wanted to engage more families than just a handful of voices. I do like the idea of having a standing group, but then I also was conscious of not putting too much burden on families either. So, and because my research spans, it's all related to developmental coordination disorder, but it could be early intervention, it could be brain imaging, it could be diagnosis. So there's different topics that might be of interest to families more so than others. So, and because I have a database of over 800 families at my disposal, then I have potential people to draw upon. So,
Great, thank you.
yeah.
I can jump on that too, which is that although I think the Standing Community Advisory Board is a really important effort for a variety of reasons, and I like the idea that there is this component of our lab that will always be there for stable communication with the community, and that the board serves this role of helping with training, but also increasing accessibility and inclusion in the lab. I also very much see the benefits of then potentially having a smaller committee for specific research projects, because we have run into some challenges or just, considerations with some of our research projects, which is some of our community advisory board are parents of very young children on the spectrum with really high support needs, and others are parents of individuals who are diagnosed in adulthood who have very different support needs. And sometimes when we're presenting, for example, we did a recent project on expert consensus among clinicians, but also recently diagnosed autistic adults about the autism diagnostic process. And I think that was super relevant for a number of people on our board, but there were also a few parents there who had very young children who felt like, I don't know exactly what to contribute here, so I'm just going to kind of keep my mouth shut. It's interesting for me to hear. So I think, there's benefits to breadth, but also potentially around specific research projects. You might want to pick people with very specific experiences around that research question. So I really look forward actually to our standing board potentially, as I said, creating these opportunities for different levels of involvement, and potentially even smaller ventures around specific research projects like grants in the future.
Great, thank you. So we do have one question that was typed that I'm just going to read, and then we'll get to Peter. I see has raised his hand. So from Paulina, she says, sorry, she's commuting, so she's going to type the question and asks, for a master's student with very limited time and funds, how might each of you recommend involving patient and community partners in the best way for a project? Not sure who wants to go first.
I can. So I think well, let me back up. I don't know what your research is about, and so perhaps not every single study needs a family partner, but I think if you even have the opportunity to have even one person, if it's a condition that you're studying, to read your proposal or make a comment on your proposal, and you could give them a gift card or payment for that one service. It's not true engagement, but at least it's getting feedback from a person with lived experience, and that could help for a master's project. There's also small grants that are often available for trainees. So those grants might be able to be used towards family engagement throughout your process. So it really depends on the time and your project, and yeah.
I was going to say something similar. I had this comment in my postdoc, and I always used to talk to Priscilla about it. And it would be nice if there were more small grants that we could use for honoraria. The Leong Center has knowledge, community engagement, small grants, right, Priscilla? And then also, I think similar to what Dr. Zwicker said, is just having like scaling it down. So for my postdoc, I only had 3 people on my advisory group. So it was, I guess, like a more affordable option and smaller scale for me to manage in a short time period because I had 2 years to do that work. So I think it's just scaling it down and keeping your eye out for little pots of money wherever you can.
Great, thank you. I'm sure Connor or Mac, if you want to add anything there, or...
I think I agree with everything that's been said. I would say in terms of little pots of money that we've been able to find, even just to support these efforts, I was able to get some support through the Community Engaged Learning Center at UBC because, as I said, there's a real training component of this as well. So that's actually funded a lot of our CAB work in the lab. And we're also able to get some funding through UBC's STEER initiative, which is focused on anti-racist and inclusive equity promoting kind of efforts at UBC. So we were able to get little bits of money to fund some of this work and support and enhance the research through mechanisms like that.
Great, thank you. So there was Peter. I know you had your hand raised. I wasn't sure if you still have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, there you are.
Hello, I'm Peter. I'm from the UBC Idea Lab, Civil Nursing. And my question is about the advisory the board. How can you recruit some the patient or the community members into your advisory? Because one problem is the representativeness. I mean, the team member may not represent all the population, and there has some population is vulnerable or marginalized. Do you consider about this situation, and how can you recruit how can they let the advisory member represent all the patient or the population you are targeted? Yeah, thank you. What strategies have you used? Thank you.
Sorry. I think the main thing is knowing that you're not going to be able to represent everybody. But because you're not going to be able to include every single member of the community, and all of their perspectives and experiences. But what we did with our lab was we were really intentional with the people that we were looking for. We wanted to include people who had different experiences and different connections to the community, who had experienced navigating autism diagnoses and supporting children with autism as a someone who English is a second language, someone who is navigating it from Indigenous perspectives, from navigating it from racialized perspectives, different levels of support needs. We're intentionally selecting, like we had a lot of applicants who were wonderful people and who had really important things to say, but they had very similar backgrounds and perspectives as another person who applied. So we unfortunately unfortunately decided not to include people who had sort of replicative ideas and perspectives, so we could fill those 12 seats that we have with as many perspectives as possible. And then I think another thing when you're trying to have so many opinions is what we said earlier, is like making sure that people know that we're not their different opinions come from different experiences. So was really important for us to make sure that we weren't saying one opinion is better than the other, one opinion is correct and one isn't. And we were just collecting as much information as possible. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd just add to that, it kind of reminded me of some approaches in qualitative work, which is sometimes in qualitative research, you're really looking for people who have a lot of shared experience. And sometimes you're purposefully recruiting for quite disparate backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives. And that's how we approached it. So we did have some ideas ahead of time, or what are the groups that are underrepresented in autism research? whose voices maybe aren't being heard as consistently, because those might be the folks who aren't as represented on our research team as well. Because those are folks that really we need to be talking to and trying to engage some of those perspectives. While also, as Max said, understanding that just talking to one person, even from a more marginalized group, is not going to give you a comprehensive understanding of like everybody's perspectives on that, but just trying to diversify a bit, understanding those blind spots.
Great, thank you. Jill or Andi, I'm not sure if you have anything you want to add.
I can add that I think that's where the internal criteria comes in, is that we have like the eligibility criteria, but within that, there's certain groups, I guess, that you want to make sure you're including in your advisory group. So just giving thought to that before you start recruiting.
Okay, great. Jill?
Yeah, I think the only other thing is, initially you're asking for people to indicate interest to engage, and to reach some of the more diversification, you may have to shoulder tap a little more than and be intentional in trying to seek out those populations, which is easier said than done. And like I say, it's a work in progress, but I think to have that intention in mind and, do the best that you can.
Great, thank you.
Could I add one thing? I do think that's where being thoughtful about how to approach the process can really make a difference too, because people will check out your website and the language that you're using and how you're engaging with them for kind of signals of if you're open to different perspectives that may have been more historically represented in research or not. So I think that can make a difference as well, because sometimes people who are from more marginalized identities can really have a lot of skepticism about engaging with the research projects and if they're going to be tokenized, et cetera. So I think that's where some of the front end work can be quite useful as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm just going to move to one question over the chat. Somebody is asking if they're a person with lived experience, including a student with lived experience, and they would like to get involved in an advisory group or a committee like this. Are there certain resources you could suggest for how they might find these? So I know, for example, in BC, there's the Reach BC platform, which sometimes lists that. But if either of you have other suggestions for people based in BC and Ontario, that would be great.
I joined the lab and I reached out to join the lab because I, in a way where I was like, I'm not really interested at the time in conducting research, but I was interested in the way that research is done. So I just contacted a bunch of labs, and like Connor was saying, I was looking in all of my jobs, I look for the way that people talk about disability. Look for the way people talk about ADHD and autism, which are my two community connections. As an autistic and ADHD person, but just reaching out, finding people, if you're interested in research and interested in all of these things, contacting those authors, contacting people. There's often a connections thing, tab about us, how to join members of our lab on people's websites. So just putting out your name, seeing if there's anything available, or proposing that maybe it's something that you're interested in helping out starting, which is what I was doing.
Which is part of how we are where we are. So I just want to second everything Max said.
That's great.
The other thing, I guess, is that more and more institutions are setting up patient and family councils or other things as an institution. And so aside from different research programs, there might also be like a BC Children's Hospital and BC Children's Hospital Research Institute and other avenues in that space as well. So if there's an area that you're interested in, then you could look for researchers in that area, and as I say, check out their websites and so on.
Great, thank you. Andi, do you have anything to add about anything? I don't know, maybe Toronto specific, Ontario based?
I think that we, on the Leong Center website, not to keep promoting them, but on the Leong Center website, there's part of the page, Priscilla, correct me if I'm wrong, but that connects organizations looking for partners. So that can be somewhere else where you could check.
Yeah, it's called the
Yes.
Collaboration Hub.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. And then Peter, did you have a follow-up question? I think I saw that you had raised your hand again.
Yeah. Another question, sorry. And also, I would want to ask you, is there any indicators for you to assess the involvement of the patient? Because, sometimes when you speak about something, they want some feedbacks. If you have no feedbacks, so sometimes their problems cannot be solved because the system, there are some obstacles. You cannot fulfill all their questions. So they may maybe feel frustrated. They will not speak to you again. So is there an indicator for you to assess what all the members in your committee has been actively involved every time? So it means they have their answer they get feedback from their questions. They think they are validated and they want to speak to your research. Yeah.
What we do is we take our notes. We have a note taker who's a member of the community advisory board or a member of the planning committee, and they're there taking notes almost verbatim. It's quite impressive. And then we collect quotes from those notes and we create a table with feedback or with original what we proposed, feedback with names, and then well, we don't do names, we do initials, but and then we do our proposed response. So we make sure that people see that we're listening, that we have paid attention to what they're saying, and then we repropose it to them. Another thing that we're doing with our research, which I think is really great, is at the end when the person who's in charge of our research, when they are finishing it up and using any quotes or using any references to something that a member did, we have a closing interview with each member of our community advisory board to make sure that our interpretations of what they said, the feedback that they gave, their responses in our check-in surveys, all of those were accurately interpreted. So people have the final say on how they were represented and what they felt about the community advisory board. Yeah, they have the final say on that. So yeah, that's what we've been doing that I think has been really beneficial to make sure that people know that we're listening to them. And then, like I think Connor mentioned it in the presentation, but if there's something that's proposed that isn't possible for whatever reason, because research is complicated and hard and very funding based and very timely, takes up a lot of time. So we explain in the meeting why this is something that's probably not viable, but often affirm that like this is a great idea. If we had all the money in the world, if we had all of this, that would be great. But like because of the way that our grant is structured or because of the way that our lab is structured, we're unable to do that at this time. That's what we do at ASAP.
Yeah. I would say our document's a lot like a revise and resubmit to a journal. Like that's how we approach it. Here's what we heard in terms of the feedback, and here's how we're responding. And sometimes you can make changes, and sometimes you can't because it's outside the scope of the project or it's not, you don't have that data, et cetera. So that's how we approach it.
Okay, great. Andi or Jill, do you have anything to add to that? No? Okay, great. I think what brings us to the end of our time. So I just wanted to thank the presenters again for such great presentations and such a meaningful discussion, and for everybody who tuned in to listen. And then I'm just going to turn it back over to Priscilla now for some final words.
Yes, I'd like to echo the same message as Kim, thanking our presenters, of course, for joining us today at the session and sharing a little bit about the work that they are leading. It's certainly given us a lot to think about. I'd also like to share this is our last session before we take a summer break for the Trainee Hub. We'll be announcing the next series of events in our September Leong Center newsletter. And certainly, we want to wish you all a wonderful day, a wonderful summer. And if you haven't done so already, we've popped into the chat a very short evaluation form that we would appreciate you completing to help continue feeding in questions, feeding in potential topics that you would like to be covered in future sessions. So thank you very much, everyone, and have yourselves a wonderful day.